The chime was gentle, a polite fiction against the drone of the twin Rolls-Royce engines holding them 7 miles above the earth. Evelyn Reed felt it more than heard it, a subtle vibration through the plush leather of seat 6A. She had paid a premium for the lie of peace, for the manufactured tranquility of business class on a long-haul flight. For 12 hours, she could pretend she was just a name on a manifest, a CEO catching up on sleep, not a woman whose mind still calculated trajectories in her dreams. The announcement that followed shattered the illusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Davies speaking." The voice was tight, stretched thin over a wire of forced calm. "We've had to make an unexpected deviation from our flight plan due to unforeseen geopolitical developments. Airspace ahead of us has been closed. We are being rerouted by regional control. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Cabin crew, prepare for turbulence." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Phones were lifted, seeking a signal that wasn't there. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't need a screen to tell her what was happening. Geopolitical developments was a sterile phrase for war. Airspace closed meant someone had just drawn a line in the sky with surface-to-air missiles. She opened her eyes, the deep blue of the cabin's mood lighting reflecting off irises the color of storm clouds. She had seen this before, not from a passenger seat but from a cockpit wrapped in carbon fiber and armored glass. Her body went still, a predator's stillness, as she parsed the captain's words. Rerouted. Through where? The safe corridors would be clogged. The secondary routes would be questionable. The plane banked, steeper than protocol allowed. The groan of the airframe a low complaint against the sudden stress. A flight attendant stumbled, catching herself on a seat back. Evelyn's focus narrowed, her senses extending beyond her seat, feeling the subtle shifts in the aircraft's trim, the slight oscillation in the turn. The pilot was tense. Good, but fighting the aircraft, not flying with it. He was a bus driver suddenly forced to race at Le Mans. A second announcement came, not 10 minutes later. The captain's voice was stripped of all pretense now, raw and strained. "Folks, we're in a difficult situation. We have a technical issue with our primary navigation system, and the backup is struggling to acquire a satellite link in this corridor. The instructions we are receiving from ground control are highly specific. It's a manual flight path and it's challenging." He paused, and the inhalation was audible over the intercom. "Is there anyone on board this aircraft with a current or former military aviation background? Specifically, a combat pilot? If you are on board, please make yourself known to the cabin crew immediately." Silence descended upon the cabin, thick and absolute. Passengers exchanged bewildered, fearful glances. A combat pilot? On a commercial flight? It was the stuff of cheap thrillers. Evelyn remained perfectly still. Her life as the founder of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm was a carefully constructed fortress, designed to keep the past buried. She had traded a G-suit for bespoke suits, a helmet for board meetings. But the past was never truly gone. It was muscle memory. It was the ghost of engine noise in her ears when the world went quiet. A young man in the seat across the aisle was filming the cabin with his phone, a nervous grin on his face, narrating his own impending doom for a social media that couldn't see it. The world was a spectacle, but Evelyn could feel the truth in the airframe's vibrations. This was not a spectacle. This was a razor's edge. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt. The quiet click echoed in the silent cabin. She stood, her simple, expensive gray cashmere sweater and black trousers a stark contrast to the memory of a flight suit. Every eye turned to her as she walked toward the front of the plane, her steps measured and calm, a woman walking toward a ghost she thought she had long since outrun. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Sarah with fear tightening the corners of her eyes, met her at the galley curtain. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat." The captain asked a question, Evelyn said. Her voice was low, devoid of inflection. "I'm here to answer it." Sarah's eyes scanned her, the tailored clothes, the poised demeanor. Disbelief warred with desperation on her face. "You're a pilot." "I was," Evelyn corrected softly. "A long time ago." Now, if you don't mind, he sounds like he's in a hurry. The cockpit door was a sealed barrier between the passenger world and the unfolding crisis. Sarah spoke into the intercom, her voice trembling slightly. "Captain, a passenger is here. A woman. She says she was a pilot." The reply was clipped, stressed. "A private pilot? Does she have hours on a twin engine? We're flying an A350. For God's sake, not a Cessna." Evelyn leaned toward the intercom, her voice cutting through the static with quiet authority. "My last airframe was a single-seat, twin-engine tactical fighter. I have 700 hours in contested airspace and another 2,000 in test flights. I can read a terrain map. You need another set of eyes. Let me in." There was a moment of charged silence from the other side of the door. Then the heavy click of the lock disengaging. The door opened. The cockpit was bathed in the red and green glow of the instrument panels. Captain Davies, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a sheen of sweat on his forehead, stared at her. His expression was a mixture of desperation and profound skepticism. Beside him, the young first officer, Ben, looked utterly bewildered. "You," Davies said, his voice a low growl of disbelief. He was looking at a CEO, not a stick-and-rudder hero. "Me," Evelyn confirmed, stepping over the threshold. Her eyes weren't on him. They were already scanning the primary flight display, the navigation display, the myriad of readouts that formed the aircraft's nervous system. She saw it instantly, the erratic flight path, the warning flags on the NAV screen. They were flying blind, guided only by hurried, panicked vectors from a voice on the radio. That voice crackled to life now, sharp and laced with military jargon. "Flight 22, this is Aegis Control. Your deviation is putting you dangerously close to the eastern ridge. Correct your heading to 030 immediately. And Captain, I don't have time for games. Who is this woman you're talking to? Get her out of the cockpit. Now." The voice belonged to a man who lived by the book, a man for whom a civilian in a crisis cockpit was an intolerable variable. Davies looked at Evelyn, his jaw tight. He was the captain, the final authority. But he was also a man drowning, and she had just thrown him a line, no matter how unbelievable it seemed. "She's a passenger Aegis. She claims to have military experience." "Claims?" The voice from Aegis was pure ice. "I don't care if she claims to be Amelia Earhart. This is a restricted military channel, and you are flying a civilian aircraft through a live-fire zone. Your only job is to follow my instructions precisely. Remove her, Captain, or I will report you for gross negligence." The threat was clear. Davies's career was on the line. Evelyn ignored the disembodied voice. Her attention was fixed on the terrain overlay. The corridor Aegis was vectoring them through was a coffin. A deep, winding valley with limited maneuverability and, if her instincts were right, perfect ambush points. It was the path of least resistance which, in a real conflict, made it the most dangerous. "Captain," she said, her tone level, cutting through his indecision. "Aegis is flying you by numbers on a map. They're not in this plane. I can feel what the air is doing. I can see the shear on the ridgeline ahead. Their vector is going to fly you straight into a downdraft that will drop you 500 feet before you can correct. At this altitude, that's a death sentence." Ben, the first officer, glanced from his screen to hers, his eyes widening. He'd seen the wind shear warnings flickering, but had dismissed them as phantom readings from the struggling sensors. "She's right, Captain," Ben whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "The predictive shear alert is going crazy." Davies looked from the screen, to his young co-pilot, to the impossibly calm woman standing behind him. Every regulation, every line in his operations manual, screamed at him to throw her out. But his gut, the primal instinct that keeps pilots alive, told him she was right. Just then, the plane lurched violently, a sickening drop that sent a collective gasp through the cabin. The downdraft, exactly as she'd predicted. Davies wrestled with the controls, his knuckles white. Evelyn didn't wait for an invitation. She moved with fluid grace into the jump seat behind them, her eyes locked on the world outside the armored glass. Ask Aegis for the raw satellite imagery of the corridor ahead, she commanded, not to Davies but to Ben. Tell them you need to see the thermal hotspots. Now! The Aegis controller came back, his voice furious. Flight 22, that is classified intelligence. Your request is denied. Stick to the goddamn vector I gave you. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice low and urgent, meant only for the two men in front of her. He's not telling you something. He's pushing you through here for a reason, and he's not telling you what it is. He's not trying to save a plane. He's using it. The implication hung in the air, cold and terrifying. They were not just lost. They were bait. The near miss with the downdraft had broken something in Captain Davies. The rigid adherence to protocol, the by-the-book skepticism, it all fractured, replaced by the stark, cold reality of their situation. He looked at Evelyn, truly looked at her this time, and saw not a passenger in expensive clothes, but a concentration so absolute it seemed to hum in the tight space of the cockpit. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "Take the right seat," he said to her, unbuckling his own harness and gesturing for Ben to move to the captain's chair. "You have the comms. I'll fly." "No," Evelyn said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She was already moving, sliding past the center console into the first officer's seat. "You and Ben know this plane's systems. You handle power, flaps, gear, and you watch for system failures. I'll fly. Ben, you handle communications. Call me out a new heading every 30 seconds. Keep your eyes on that terrain map." She slid the seat forward, her movements economical and precise. Her hands, unadorned except for a simple, worn leather cord around her right wrist, moved across the controls with an eerie familiarity. It wasn't the tentative touch of a guest. It was the sure, confident contact of a master. She adjusted the rudder pedals, her feet finding them without looking down. Her fingers danced across the multifunction display, changing settings, bringing up pages Davies hadn't looked at since his last simulator check ride. She was syncing with the machine, her mind merging with the complex web of electronics and hydraulics. Ben watched, mesmerized. It was like watching a concert pianist sit down at an unfamiliar Steinway and immediately play a flawless concerto. Evelyn strapped herself into the 5-point harness, the clicks of the buckles sounding like the loading of a weapon. She took the side stick, her grip light but firm. For a moment, she closed her eyes, her head tilted back against the rest. She wasn't praying. She was listening. Listening to the engines, to the airflow over the wings, to the almost imperceptible groan of the fuselage. The Airbus A350 was a titan, a graceful, heavy beast of the skies, designed for stability and efficiency. It was not a fighter jet. It would not respond with razor-sharp aggression. It had to be coaxed, persuaded, its immense inertia respected and then bent to her will. She took a deep, steadying breath, the recycled air of the cabin tasting faintly of ozone and fear. The leather cord on her wrist felt cool against her skin. It was a simple, braided thing, a gift from her mentor, a man who flew experimental craft in the desert and taught her that flying wasn't about dominating the air, but about dancing with it. "You don't fight the storm," he used to say. "You find the quiet spaces between the winds." Aegis control. Ben's voice was now steady, drawing strength from her calm. "Flight 22 is holding its current position. We require updated flight path options. The current corridor is untenable due to extreme meteorological conditions." The controller's reply was laced with venom. "Negative, Flight 22. Your only option is the prescribed route. Proceed immediately or you will be designated as non-compliant." The threat was unspoken but clear. Non-compliant aircraft in a hostile zone were considered hostile. Evelyn opened her eyes. They were clear, focused, and cold as ice. "He's not giving us a choice," she said, her voice a low murmur. She keyed the intercom for the cabin. "Flight attendants, take your seats and secure yourselves. Now, it's going to be a rough ride." With that, her hands moved. She disengaged the autopilot with 2 decisive clicks. The massive plane was hers now. "My aircraft," she whispered. The words a mantra, a reclamation. She eased the side stick to the left, and the A350 began a slow, deliberate turn, away from the Aegis-approved corridor and toward a narrow, jagged opening in the mountain range to the north, a path that didn't exist on any official chart. The Aegis controller's voice exploded over the radio. "Flight 22, what are you doing? You are deviating. Turn back to heading 030 immediately." "That is an order." Evelyn's thumb moved to the transmit button. "Aegis control," she said, her voice utterly calm, projecting an authority that silenced the man on the ground. "The pilot you are speaking to has determined that your vector presents an unacceptable risk to this aircraft and its passengers. We are proceeding on an alternate route. You can either help us, or you can stay out of our way. The choice is yours." "Flight 22 out." She switched frequencies, cutting him off. The cockpit was silent, save for the hum of the avionics. Davies stared at her, his face pale. "They could shoot us down." "They could," Evelyn agreed without looking at him. "But the people who put those missile batteries on the ground are in that valley. The one Aegis was so keen on us flying through. Whoever is down there, they're the real target. We were just the distraction." She pushed the throttles forward. The twin engines spooled up with a deep, hungry roar. The A350, a vessel of commerce and luxury, surged forward like a warhorse, diving toward the teeth of the mountains. They were no longer flying a route. They were making an ingress. The canyon walls rose up on either side of them, sheer faces of granite that seemed to scrape at the wingtips. Davies, a 30-year veteran of the skies, had never seen anything like it. This wasn't flying. It was a violation of physics. A plane of this size had no business being here. Its turn radius was too wide, its response time too slow. Yet, under her hands, the behemoth moved with an impossible grace. She wasn't making sharp, jerky turns. She was flowing, anticipating the curves of the canyon seconds before they arrived, using the plane's own momentum in a controlled, elegant drift. Ben was calling out changes in wind speed and direction, his voice a steady rhythm against the roar of the engines. "Sheer from the right, 10 knots. Updraft in 5 seconds. Evelyn would make a minute adjustment to the trim, a fractional input on the stick, and the plane would ride the turbulence like a surfer on a wave. Her eyes were constantly in motion, scanning from the windscreen to the instruments and back again, her mind processing a torrent of data. Altitude, airspeed, bank angle, engine temperature, the proximity warnings that were now screaming a constant, terrified litany. She filtered it all out, focusing on the singular goal of survival. This was her element. The boardroom, the stock market, the endless meetings, that was the foreign land. This, with death a hand's breadth away and a machine an extension of her own will, this was home. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the cockpit, a high-pitched, insistent tone that made the blood run cold. "Radar lock," Ben shouted, his voice cracking. "We've got a lock." On the display, a red triangle flashed, indicating a threat from a ridge above them and to the left. A surface-to-air missile launcher. It was the trap she knew was there. "They've got our heat signature," Davies said, his voice tight with dread. "We're too big, too slow. We're dead." Evelyn's face was a mask of concentration. Her eyes flicked to the energy readout. They were heavy, loaded with fuel and passengers. A high-G climb was impossible. A steep dive was suicide in this canyon. They had one chance, one move. "Hold on," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command to the universe. Her right hand pushed the throttles to the firewall, demanding every ounce of power the engines could give. The A350 screamed in protest, accelerating down the narrow granite corridor. Her left hand pushed the side stick hard to the right, away from the threat, banking the aircraft until the wingtips seemed to brush the canyon wall. For a terrifying second, Davies was sure she was going to fly them straight into the rock. But it was a feint. Just as the missile launch tone shrieked in their ears, the confirmation that a weapon was in the air, she snapped the stick to the left. It was a maneuver that should have been impossible. The colossal aircraft, groaning under the strain, reversed its bank with a violent, gut-wrenching shudder. The forces were immense. In the cabin, Unsecured objects became projectiles. Passengers were slammed into their seats, the G-force stealing their breath. Alarms blared across the cockpit, a cacophony of electronic panic. Overload warnings flashed in angry red letters. But through the windscreen, Davies saw her genius. She had used the sheer wall of the canyon as a shield. The missile, tracking their initial heat signature, screamed past them, unable to correct its course in time. It slammed into the granite cliff face where they would have been. A silent, brilliant flash of light followed seconds later by the percussive thump of the explosion, a shockwave that buffeted their plane. The immediate threat was gone. They were alive. Ben was breathing in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter reverence. Davies simply stared at her, speechless. He had just witnessed a 180-ton passenger jet move like a fighter. Evelyn, however, showed no sign of relief. Her breathing was even, her eyes already scanning ahead for the next threat. The maneuver had cost them precious energy and altitude. "Give me engine status," she said, her voice a clipped, professional command. "Nominal," Davies managed to say, his voice hoarse. "No flameout. But we're getting stress warnings on the starboard wing spar." "It'll hold," she said, not with hope, but with the certainty of an engineer who knew the breaking points of her machine. The missile was gone, but the launcher was still up there. And now they knew exactly where Flight 22 was. The reprieve was short-lived. Ben's voice, tight with renewed tension, cut through the relative quiet. "She's back on the frequency. Not Aegis. It's a direct channel." He's patched through. A new voice filled the cockpit, overriding all other channels. It was the Aegis controller, but his tone had undergone a complete transformation. The arrogant fury was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate urgency. "Flight 22, this is Aegis. Please respond. I see what you did. Christ, I see what you did. You need to listen to me. You need to listen to me very carefully." Evelyn kept her eyes on the sky ahead, but she nodded at Ben. He keyed the mic. "Go ahead, Aegis. We're listening. The asset that SAMsite is targeting. It's a downed pilot. A special recon mission. Call sign Viper 1. His chopper went down 20 minutes ago. He's pinned down in a dry riverbed about 3 clicks from your current position. We can't get an extraction team in there with that launcher active on the ridge. They've tried twice. Lost a drone already." He paused, the sound of his breathing heavy over the comm. "You've drawn their attention. They think you're a military transport trying something clever. They're reorienting the launcher to track you. They'll be ready for you at the next canyon opening." Now it all made sense. The corridor, the refusal to divert the classified information. They hadn't been bait by accident. They had been a strategic gambit, a civilian plane full of souls risked by a commander on the ground who had run out of options. A cold anger settled in Evelyn's gut, but she pushed it down. It was fuel. It was focus. "What do you want from us, Aegis?" Evelyn asked, her own voice taking over the comms. The controller hesitated, as if he couldn't believe what he was about to ask. "The extraction team is on standby. They need a window. Just 30 seconds of cover is all they need to get Viper 1 out of there. But they need that launcher blind. Can you do that? Can you create a diversion?" Davies stared at her, horrified. "A diversion? With a passenger plane? He's insane. We need to get out of here." Evelyn ignored him. Her mind was already working, processing the variables. The A350 had no flares, no countermeasures, no weapons. But it had mass. It had 2 of the most powerful turbofan engines in the world. It had presence. She brought up the terrain map again, zooming in on the coordinates the controller was now feeding them. She saw it. The dry riverbed, a wadi, snaking along the base of the ridge where the SAM launcher was perched. The extraction point was in a small basin where the wadi widened. "Aegis," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "Give me the exact elevation of that launcher. And I need to know the wind direction at ground level in that wadi." There was a flurry of keyboard clicks from the other end. "Launcher is at 4,200 feet MSL. Wind is negligible at the surface. Less than 5 knots, variable." Perfect. She turned to Davies and Ben, her expression grim but resolute. We're going to give them their diversion. Ben, I want you to calculate the lowest possible safe altitude we can fly at our current weight. I'm not talking about FAA minimums. I'm talking about the absolute physical limit before we hit ground effect. Davies, you are on damage control. The second you see a system go into the red, you tell me. And strap yourselves in. This will be worse than the last 1 inch. Davies looked like he wanted to protest, to scream that this was a suicidal, insane plan. But he saw the look in her eyes, an unyielding certainty that went beyond mere confidence. And he simply nodded, his hands flying over his console, preparing the aircraft for another descent into hell. My plan is simple, Evelyn stated. Her voice as flat and hard as the canyon walls around them. We are going down into that wadi. We're going to fly below the ridgeline so the SAM can't get a firing solution on us. The ground in that riverbed is sand and silt. Decades of it ground into fine powder. When we fly over it at 200 feet and nearly 400 knots, the engine wash and the wingtip vortices won't just kick up dust. We're going to create a sandstorm, a solid wall of dirt that will rise up and blind everything on that ridge. That will be the extraction team's window. Davies stared at her, a dawning comprehension on his face. He was finally seeing the chessboard as she saw it. They were going to use the laws of physics as a weapon. They were going to turn a passenger jet into an instrument of tactical obscurantism. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. Aegis, are you copying? Evelyn's voice was sharp on the comms. Tell the extraction team, call sign Vulture, to be ready. The screen will go up on my signal. The signal will be Fury Unleashed. They will have 30, maybe 40 seconds at most before the dust settles. Tell Viper 1 to be ready to move. There was a pause. Then the controller's voice, now filled with a sense of awe. Who is this? Who is flying this plane? Just a passenger, Evelyn said, her hands steady on the controls. Get your teams ready. She took one last look at the instruments, then at the yawning mouth of the wadi ahead. This was it, the point of no return. She pushed the side stick forward, and the A350 began its descent, a silver giant stooping toward the desert floor. The ground proximity warnings began to shriek, a desperate, electronic scream that filled the cockpit. She ignored them. They were an alarm for a world with rules. Down here there were no rules. There was only the air, the rock, and her will. The plane bucked as it entered the lower, denser air of the canyon, the engines inhaling the superheated desert atmosphere. The first of the canyon walls flashed past the cockpit window, a blur of red rock so close it felt like they could reach out and touch it. They were in. The world outside the windscreen became a narrow, hurtling tunnel of sand and stone. The roar of the engines was deafening, trapped and amplified by the wadi walls. The entire airframe vibrated, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the soles of her feet, up her spine. This was the edge of the envelope, the place where planes came apart. Evelyn felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She was no longer Evelyn Reed, billionaire CEO. That was a costume she wore. Here, flying on instinct and adrenaline, she was her true self. Vulture team is in position, Ben relayed, his voice strained. They're waiting for your signal. Ahead, she could see the basin where the downed pilot was hidden. It was time. She could feel the aircraft fighting her, the disturbed air trying to wrench control from her grasp. She held it steady through sheer force of will. Stand by, she commanded. She brought the throttles to their stops, pushing them into the toga detent. Takeoff/go-around power. It was the absolute maximum the engines could produce. The acceleration was brutal, pinning them all to their seats. The roar became a physical presence, a concussive force. Outside, the desert floor began to boil. The jet wash from the two massive engines, each one capable of generating nearly 100,000 pounds of thrust, hit the fine sand and silt like a bomb. A cloud of dust erupted behind them, a roiling, churning wave of brown that instantly engulfed the wadi. Now! She yelled over the engine scream. She keyed the mic, her voice cutting through the chaos. Fury Unleashed. She held the plane steady, a scant 100 feet above the wadded floor, for 15 agonizing seconds, feeding the manufactured storm, turning the air itself into a solid curtain. The world behind them simply ceased to exist, swallowed by a brownout of epic proportions. Then, just as they reached the end of the basin, she pulled back on the stick. The A350, relieved of its low-altitude torment, clawed for the sky. The maneuver was steep, aggressive, pushing the G-forces to their limit once more. As they climbed, they broke through the top of their own dust cloud. For a moment, they could see it from above. A massive, opaque plume of sand that completely obscured the extraction zone and the ridge where the SAM launcher sat waiting, blind and useless. The comms crackled to life, the voice of the Vulture team leader, high on adrenaline. "We've got him. Viper 1 is on board. I don't know who you are, Flight 22, but we owe you one. Vulture is egressing to the north. We are clear." A wave of relief so profound it was physically painful washed through the cockpit. Davies let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for the last 2 minutes. Ben was laughing, a wild, giddy sound of disbelief. They had done it. They had pulled a downed pilot out of an impossible situation using a commercial airliner. But Evelyn wasn't celebrating. She was banking the plane hard, turning them away from the mountains and toward the open sky, gaining altitude, putting distance between them and the danger. Her job wasn't done until the passengers were safe on the ground. The frequency was a chaotic buzz of relief and coded chatter. Then, a new voice cut through, patched directly from the extraction chopper. It was clear, calm, and laced with an unmistakable authority. The voice of a man who had seen it all and was surprised by nothing. Until today. "Aegis, this is Viper 1, the voice said. "Let me talk to the pilot of that heavy." Ben glanced at Evelyn, who gave a slight nod. He patched him through. "Flight 22, this is Viper 1. I'm a little busy right now, but I needed to say that was the single most insane and brilliant piece of flying I have ever witnessed. And I've witnessed a lot." He paused, and the sound of the helicopter's rotors whirred in the background. "That final maneuver, the low-level pass and the pitch-up, the way you used the engine wash as cover, I've only ever seen one pilot practice that theory. It was a simulation for a Black Ops insertion years ago. Never thought I'd see it for real." Another pause, this one longer, more thoughtful. He said only one pilot he ever trained had the nerve and the fine motor control to even attempt it. Called her a ghost in the machine. The man's voice grew quiet, almost reverent. "Ma'am, what's your call sign?" Evelyn's hands were steady on the controls, guiding the A350 into the smoother air of higher altitudes. The past was reaching for her, a ghost of its own. She had left that name, that entire life, buried in the desert sand. "I'm a civilian pilot," she said, her voice quiet. "I don't have a call sign. Respectfully, ma'am, I call bullshit." The voice of Viper 1 came back instantly, without malice, but with absolute certainty. "That move was a signature. There's no mistaking it. Is this Fury?" The name hung in the air of the cockpit, an incantation. Fury, a name whispered in hangars and flight simulators, a legend from the world of experimental and tactical aviation. A pilot who could make an aircraft do things its designers never dreamed of. A pilot who had simply vanished years ago. Davies and Ben turned to stare at her. The quiet, impeccably dressed woman in the right seat was not just a competent pilot. She was a myth. A new voice, cold and official, broke the silence on the military channel. It wasn't the Aegis controller. It was someone higher up, someone who had been monitoring the entire exchange. "Stand by, Viper 1. There was a moment of silence, the sound of a file being accessed, a record being checked. Then the voice returned, stripped of all emotion. "Confirm call sign. I repeat, pilot of Flight 22. Confirm call sign." Fury, it was an order. Evelyn closed her eyes for a single weary beat. The fortress she had built around her life had been breached. The ghost was no longer at the door. It was in the cockpit with her. She keyed the mic one last time. Her voice was a low whisper, a confession and a confirmation. Affirmative, control. Call sign confirmed. The silence that followed was more profound than any noise. In that moment, on a secure channel connecting a speeding airliner, a rescue helicopter, and a distant command center, a legend was reborn. Captain Davies looked at the woman beside him not as a passenger, but as something else entirely, something he couldn't quite comprehend. He wasn't just sharing a cockpit. He was in the presence of greatness. They flew on in silence, escorted by the dawn. There were no more threats, no more frantic communications. They were given a new vector to a secure military airbase in a neutral neighboring country. As the sun crested the horizon, bathing the scarred and strained airframe in a soft, golden light, Evelyn guided the A350 through a flawless final approach. The landing was perfect, a gentle kiss of rubber on tarmac that belied the hell the aircraft had just endured. She taxied the plane to a remote section of the airfield, away from the main terminal, where a reception committee was already waiting. It was not the usual ground crew. It was a line of olive-drab vehicles and stern-faced soldiers who formed a perimeter around the aircraft as soon as the engines spooled down. Evelyn went through the shutdown checklist with the same methodical calm she had displayed throughout the ordeal. When the final switch was flipped and the cockpit fell into an electronic silence, she unbuckled her harness. You saved us all," Captain Davies said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like it." Ben, the young first officer, just stared at her, his expression one of pure awe. He couldn't find the words. "You both did your jobs," Evelyn replied simply, giving them the credit they deserved. "You trusted me when you had every reason not to. That's what mattered." She stood and made her way out of the cockpit. The passengers, who had been kept in the dark about the true nature of their flight's detour, were deplaning onto buses, their faces a mixture of confusion, relief, and lingering fear. They looked at her as she passed, a few murmuring thanks for the safe landing, unaware that the woman in the gray cashmere sweater had just flown them through a war zone and rewritten a chapter of modern military aviation. At the bottom of the air stairs, a man in an immaculately tailored black suit and an older, uniformed Air Force general were waiting. There were no cameras, no reporters. This event would be buried under layers of classification before the plane's wheels were even chalked. The general stepped forward as Evelyn reached the tarmac. He was a man with 4 stars on his shoulder, a man who commanded legions, but he looked at her with an expression of profound respect. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply raised his hand in a slow, precise salute. It wasn't a gesture for a civilian. It was for a fellow warrior. Evelyn met his gaze and gave a slight, acknowledging nod. "Your actions today saved the lives of my operator and the 34 souls on that extraction team, Ms. Reed," the general said, his voice a low rumble. "On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you. We'll handle the debriefing and the paperwork." The man in the suit stepped forward. "We've arranged for you and the other passengers to continue your journey. A new aircraft is waiting. The story will be a catastrophic systems failure and a heroic emergency landing. It's cleaner that way." "It always is," Evelyn said, her tone devoid of irony. She looked past them at the Airbus A350. It stood silent on the tarmac, basking in the morning sun. Its sleek white fuselage was now smudged with dust and scored in several places by shrapnel from the missile's detonation. It bore the marks of a battle it was never meant to fight. She walked over to it, placing her palm flat against the cool metal of the fuselage, near one of the deeper scars. A silent communion, a pilot's thanks to her aircraft. The machine had held together. It had done everything she had asked of it, and more. Then, she turned and walked toward the waiting car, her silhouette straight, her pace unhurried. She blended back into the role of Evelyn Reed, the quiet billionaire. But something had shifted. The ghost was no longer a memory to be suppressed, but a living part of her, acknowledged and confirmed. In a quiet, secure room thousands of miles away, a technician would soon access a deeply buried digital file. A few keystrokes would change a single entry. Status: inactive. The cursor would blink, delete the word, and type a new one: reserve. The legend of Fury was off the board, but she was back in the game.